Hello beautiful people, and welcome to cycle 3 of the winter season of Sketchbook Club. So this week I feel like I've dressed a little bit like our subjects. We've decided this week to look at badgers. And the reason why we're looking at badgers is sort of multifaceted, I think. They sort of represent a shift or a transition in energy. So badgers don't typically hibernate in winter, but they do experience this sort of state of torpor, which means that their bodies slow down and adapt when the temperature plummets. And so they may spend actually time above ground at this time of the year, but they may also spend time below the ground in their sets, resting and nesting, a little bit like our dormice and our hedgehogs. So we thought it was fitting as we sort of shift between January and February, and there's a little bit of a change in energy, there's a change in the light, there's a change in the temperature, to look at a creature that sort of adapts to these changes physically and then also in terms of their behavior. And to look at how we could perhaps be inspired by the badger and some of the symbolism associated to the badger as well. So having spent the last week in the company of these beautiful black and white sort of bear-like creatures, I have to say that, you know, a lot of that symbolism has been running through my mind. So thinking about sort of the community that they create underground, the networks that they create, and you know, how they share those networks, or those networks, those spaces can later become homes for other creatures. So that sense of collaboration that we see in nature. But also thinking about their sort of spiritual symbolism. And I've given you some examples in the resources of the work of Jackie Morris. We're also looking at Wind in the Willows for this cycle. So we're looking at some of those illustrators that really brought some of these creatures to life for us when we were children and ignited that connection, that sense of connection to the animal world, sort of in a way by humanizing the animals. And, you know, I'm sort of thinking about the opposite here. I'm thinking, you know, rather than humanize the animals, how perhaps could we animalize ourselves, you know, as animate beings? So in terms of symbolism, the badger is a survivor, and it still feels like we need that survival energy as we're moving into 2022. It's also a symbol of tenacity, so sort of holding on, grit, you know, determination, and the expression to sort of badger somebody really comes to mind when we think about this, like not giving up. And this time of the year, you know, the winter starts to stretch out before us and it can feel long. And yet out there in nature, we see the first sort of shoots appearing, the first signs of spring breaking through that hard ground, a few sunnier, perhaps warmer days, although we still know we have some cold days ahead of us. So I think the badger brings with it the spirit of adaptability, you know, of sort of resilience and shifting and changing behaviours according to what is going on outside in the world, or perhaps in nature too. So we're going to stay with badgers for cycles 3 and 4. I had considered exploring bats. But if you look at our native bats, they are pretty challenging to draw. And as this sort of sketchbook class develops, I'm thinking more about how we can spend longer time with our subjects, really getting to know them and delving a little bit deeper into, you know, the stories, the symbolism and the folklore that surrounds them. So this cycle we are purely sketching badgers, and I've got some really lovely techniques up my sleeve for you in that department. And then next cycle, we'll move into that underground world a little bit further. We'll delve a little bit deeper into that world and really think about, that activity that is not always visible, that growth, that change which is happening beneath the surface. So I really hope you enjoy this cycle. I really, really enjoyed my time with the badgers. And I may have said this at the beginning, but I think it's actually influenced what I'm wearing today. They're really beautiful creatures, and I hope you really enjoy getting to know them like I did this last week.
Okay, my lovelies, let's make a start on these beautiful creatures, the badgers, yeah? And we're going to start by just looking at the shapes of their heads and then have a go at sketching their whole bodies as well. Again, a little bit like the critters from last cycle. They look a bit odd without tone, without mark making. So just be aware of that and just really, really notice. I'm just going to zoom you in on this guy here. Really, really notice that shape of the top of the head, the shape of the stripe itself and the space that's left beneath it. It's sort of like a mixture between a bear and a weasel, I think. Certainly that's what I've observed. And they are sort of our underground bears, our surviving bears. They've got bear-like paws, and most of them is fur and fluff. It would be really interesting to see, the skeleton of a badger. So just find yourself sort of an appropriate space in your sketchbook. You're just going to need a 2B pencil. I'm going to sketch using this blue pencil because it's a little bit easier for you to see on film. And I'm going to start with just one of the images from the resources here. So again, I'm going to bring you in a tiny bit closer for this just so you can see exactly what I'm doing and just move my sketchbook over a bit. And we're going to start with this line on the top of the head. So let's see if we can just find the shape of the badger's head first. So a little sort of circular shape almost. It's quite a long line from the top of their heads to the edge of their noses, and it sort of closes off at a bit of an angle as well. So you want to get that in, but with not too sharp a turn. They really remind me of dogs a little bit as well in terms of, like a hound-like sort of head. And so then really paying attention to that angle at the bottom of the chin as well. And again, using your pencil to check your marks, not assuming you're going to be perfect. And pop his ears in, which are always they're always opposite each other. And that sort of helps as well to find the position of the eye, which if you look at that sort of tone there, finishes about here, that then gives you the position of the eye as well. And again, that eye is going to look a little bit strange at the moment, but don't worry about that. You can put, the shape of that black area, you can put that in, and then you can find sort of how that white connects to the black there. And then for the nose, you're sort of looking at it from an angle too. So give yourself a little line and then sort of close that off. And then it's just about sort of adapting that drawing a little bit. Yep, so long, pointy noses, tiny little ears, and their eyesight is not very good, is it? So their eyes are quite small and almost quite hidden in amongst the sort of fur. So just playing around with capturing that shape first and have a go at that line a couple of times, don't just expect it to be perfect on the first go. So I'll give it another go here. Just trying to find that sort of weaselly shape, I suppose. Trying to find the sort of base of the chin and then looking at how that sort of finishes off in a point at the nose. Popping the eye in, getting that stripe in, noticing that it finishes before the end of the nose. And these sort of sections of white and black will give you quite a lot of information that you need here. And then they always look a lot better once you just pop their little ears in. So just popping those in. So practice that sketching to begin with. Don't worry about the realism of things like the eyes or the nose itself. You can sort of block that in ever so slightly. And then little bits of mark making here, even along this area, or starting even to darken that stripe just to help it make sense in your mind. are going to be important here. So once I put that dark area in, he already looks more like a badger, I think you'll agree. It's a funny old job I do, isn't it? But I've really enjoyed the sort of spirit, the energy of these guys this last week. I found them very grounding. And some interesting symbolism with the badger as well. Plus lots to look at in terms of behaviour, which we'll look at in cycle 4, like what do their sets look like, you know, their breeding habits, those kind of things are all very interesting to us, I think, as we start to navigate this little underground bear come weasel come not quite sure what it is, okay? So I'm going to just zoom you out a little bit more now so we can do some sort of sketching of whole shapes. Let's keep that same image and let's find it sort of that rump, that big round bottomy shape. And then let's connect it in to the head. I'm really loosely shaping, you know, sketching these shapes at the moment. It's going to look a bit strange at first. Be okay with that. And if you can get this line of the top of the neck into the rump, the rest of it's going to look a bit more convincing as a badger. Again, I'm sketching really lightly, just placing things where I think they ought to go, and then I will check myself as I go along. Popping his eye in, finding that shape of the end of his nose, and just starting to get a sense of the whole shape. And you might imagine as well, you know, the sort of shoulder or the front paw here, and sort of flatten that off because they've got quite flat feet, and then the back paw here, and then the rest of that is just belly. So it's looking more like a mouse at the moment, but that's because it doesn't have any tone on it, any covering. So just remember that too. I'm sort of looking at making a little weasel bear come mouse. And then you can pop sort of the marks in as well. So just practicing that shape under the chin, that shape on the top of the nose. And, you know, keeping an eye on your proportion as you work your way through this. Letting things like the stripes give you some of the information that you need. So let's have a look at him from another angle now, shall we? Sort of head facing down. And I'll just do his head here. But again, as many sketches as you can do here will really, really help you just to tune into the angles, the shapes, before we start to work with some other materials. Just popping in that little bit of shading in his eye, finding the shape under his chin, putting in that sort of little bit of mark making there, just that sort of dark patch, finding the shape of his head, and then letting that sort of work its way into the rest of the body. You can sketch as many times as you need to until you feel like you're really tuned into this guy. And again, the nose sort of at this angle here. And then the rest of the magic we'll do with other materials, so you don't need to worry about that too much. But yeah, it's that sort of just finding the shapes, you know, imagining that as a whole shape here, imagining this as a whole shape here, and then this as a whole shape here, and sort of trying to find those general shapes before we get sort of bogged down in the detail, I suppose. So just, you know, have a look at lots of images. Remember that sketching from the front is probably the most challenging in terms of sort of getting a sense of proportion. I'm just popping in the top of his head now. I'm just doing a little sort of from the front sketch. But it's much, much harder, I think, to sketch these from bang on the front. So, you know, try and find interesting angles where you can get an appreciation of those shapes that I was talking about before, those lines that sort of run through the badger, this sort of slinky weasel, but with quite a plump bottom, I'm going to say now. And again, like once you start to add things like the fur, even if you're just sketching that in lightly, it really helps you to find the overall sort of, you know, the overall shape as well. So it makes more sense of it once you start to add some of that detail over the top. It may look like I'm just scribbling on my drawing, but I'm really not. So do have a look at some of the sketches that I have put on the resources for this. This is just a little tuning in activity. So these do not need to be perfect. It's just about playing around with finding that shape, understanding sort of where the stripe ends up, you know, and just sort of familiarising yourself with the overall shape of the badger before we move into any more different approaches to capturing these guys. Okay, so lots of tips on the resources to help you with that. But even look there, if I just put in, you know, that dark patch over his eyes, he starts to look so much more badger-like, you know, and even that dark area under his chin helps us to find his chin. So just a little bit of tuning in to start with, having a go at sketching, not being too judgmental of the results, because again, a lot of the information comes from the fur, it comes from sort of the direction of the head, it comes from those kind of elements, okay? And then meet me back and have just some chalk and charcoal available, please. So a couple of chalk and charcoal pencils would be helpful, but otherwise if you've just got some chunky chalk and charcoal, that'd be really great for the next bit, okay? Okay folks, so we're going to have a go at doing a couple of more animated badger studies, and I think you'll probably find this easier than the sketching, which is ironic because we're going to work at it in a slightly different way. We're going from general to particular. I've just got some toned paper. I'm attempting to have this in my sketchbook this time around, so I'm planning for space for it. And I'll just pop these to one side for a minute, but we're going to start just with black and white, okay? So just with black and white. Make sure you've got, you know, an image to hand that you can work from here, something that is sort of a side view. And then I just want you to play around with a little bit of mark making first. So first of all, something that's going to be really important here is working with your white chalk on the side, and the same with your charcoal. So practice this, which is sort of creating these shapes. So finding those shapes that we were looking at in the introductory cycles and sort of starting to piece together our badger, but we're sort of leading with the light here, which you know is, you know, those of you that have been with me for a while, you know, is one of my sort of go-to for, especially for sort of sketching complex characters. So you've got this side use of, you know, your chalk, and the same with the charcoal. You can, you know, use the charcoal on its side to start to show some of that movement, some of those shapes, yeah? And then when it comes to the particular, the more detailed stuff, we're going to be working with just this Gioconda charcoal pencil and the white coal version of that as well. So, you know, you can play around with doing some mark making with those first, just in preparation for this exercise. You know, play around with doing some little marks, playing around with sort of blending between the black and the white, because we start off just black and white on the head. And then of course we go into this sort of more textured blend of black and white on the back, which makes a sort of greyish tone, but it's incredibly textured. So you can see this kind of work that I'm doing now is sort of just blending straight over the top using the white, sort of placing the black down and then pulling the white over the top. So we'll start off real chunky and then as we move along, we're going to sort of define some of the details. So forget about the details for now. Think about just that chunky sort of overall shape, if you like. So I'm just going to get me another sheet of paper and then I will meet you back here. But practice those little elements first. Practice the chalk on its side and using it to sort of shape. Practice the charcoal on its side and working over the top. And then practice a little bit of mark making with those materials as well, just to tune in before we start our more in-depth study, okay? Okay, so I've got a little bit of mixed media paper now, which I like it because it's a little bit darker. But any sort of black paper will do here, really. I just am quite a fan of this mixed media paper at the moment. So I'm going to start with just that rump, actually, that bottom, and just getting that shape in. So consciously, you know, using directional marks. And then I'm going to find the sort of top of the back as it works its way down. And then here, just very loosely and lightly for now, we're going to pop in that shape of the head, okay? And that's sort of the neck. And again, we're doing this real chunky for a reason, because we can always adapt the shape as we go along. So do that, but then do some blending for me. So directionally blending that chalk. I always find chalk and charcoal really hard. I find myself saying chalk. I don't know why, I glitch on those. So I'm sort of pulling down almost like, you know, the illusion of a leg there as I go as well, and popping in that sort of head shape, but like I said, really loosely. So we're leading with the light, and then we're going to add the dark in. So if it just looks a bit like a weird ghost horse at the moment, that is more than okay. Don't worry about it. Then I'm going to come over with my charcoal. I'm just breaking it down a little bit more because of the scale of this drawing. And I'm going to start to use that to sort of find that furry feel, you know. So starting to, because most of these little critters are fur, you know, you can actually give a lot of indication of the shape of the animal from that fur. So I'm just going to come in with the black and see if I can establish that a little bit better with the black. Again, very sketchy still. You don't need to blend so much this time, but we want to see some of that directional marks, but we can just push the material into the paper. That is okay. And then when it comes to the head and these areas, this is where I'm going to start to pay a little bit closer attention. So the nice thing about working on black is that you can sort of use it to shape the creature a little bit more. So I'm going to go for that front leg now and sort of get that shape in and start to shape the direction of the fur. I can also sort of start to find the stripe. And as we sort of were discussing in the last part, that little stripe is important. Pop the eye in and just know that this is a work in progress, all right? So it's not going to look perfect straight away. Ear. Let's get that other ear in, just very loosely. So now we're starting to find the actual badger himself. This one we're drawing, not just one that's in our sort of minds. The sense that his body's a little bit long, but I'm going to keep going anyway. And what's nice here is that you can sort of, with the black, start to shape the face and the areas around the face quite easily. So he's looking way more badgery, I think you'll agree, already. So let's get that dark stripe really established now. Let's use the white to find the top of his ear. And again, I will supply the reference picture that I used for this. I need to get a bit more mindful with my reference pictures, I've realised. And again, you can use that white to sort of blend through even these areas. So now I'm starting to bring some detail into this guy, yeah? And here, you know, it just disappears off into the black, which is really quite nice. It disappears off into the background. So a little across for the nose, a little bit of extra dark for the eyes, and then I can come back in with the white and I can lighten around the eyes and I can add the highlight. And, you know, even in these areas which are actually white, you're going to want little bits of shadow tone running through there just to show the texture of the fur. So that is allowed, yeah? And we can find sort of the shape and some of the marks on our little badger's eyes and face just from that sort of activity. And then as we get to sort of this area here, this is where we want to engage some mark making. So you may want to start actually with the black here and get that sense of the direction of the plumage. In fact, I think his bottom actually begins a little bit sooner and ends a little bit sooner. So this is where I can adjust my sketch, yeah? That's the nice thing about chalk and charcoal, is that sort of ability. Maybe I'll go in with a bit more of this, just to darken that off a little bit more. It's that ability to shift the drawing as you go along, like it's not fixed, you can keep changing it. And then here, I'm going to add some more of that sort of little marks to show texture. It could even be smaller than that, you know. And that will start to give us the shape again, a bit like the dormice, of that rump. I'm going to call it a rump. and his little tail coming off the end. Yep. And as for the feet, I mean, I can't really see them in this picture, so I'm just going to sort of say to myself that the feet are not visible, but you can look at those closely if you are sort of feel called to do so. And then I've got a sort of stripe of much lighter here, so I'm going to pop that in too. So just working in black and white makes a lot of sense. It's something we do a lot anyway at Sketch, is just sort of pair things back tonally. But it particularly makes sense for our little badger studies. And even here with these pencils, you can add, you know, just a little bit of a highlight. And again, I'm going to come back in and shape this here. So you're sort of coming in from the edge. And, you know, even little whiskers can go into this area here. And all of that will sort of make your badger look a lot more furry. I'm going to go a little bit darker around his eyes because it's got a little bit light. But again, you can't overwork this, or you need to just be careful not to overwork it too much is what I'm trying to say, I think. Because you'll just sort of lose any magic if you sort of overwork it. So again, I've got this real dark stripe here down his chest and into that little bit of his chest, and then we're going to work a lot more white through these areas and these sort of longer strokes to start to find his furry badger. So nice to do on black to begin with. It just feels that's really nice and simple. We're just using black and white. We are just pairing things back with these badgers to the bare essence. And the nice thing about chalk and charcoal is this sort of push and pull. So here I'm now looking at his back and I'm thinking actually that's not quite the right angle, so I can go in and change that. And that's the nice thing about these materials, is that fluidity, you know, this ability to shift and change where appropriate as we go along. A sketch is like a working document. It's like a draft, you know, and it doesn't really become a drawing until you start to add some of the fine details. So until then, you know, it's up for grabs. You can change it, you can shift it. And look at the difference between my sort of ghost horse at the beginning and this badger. Now, he's not absolutely perfect, but he is just a sketch. We need to remember that. And I'm going to get another image out now and show you sort of how I came about this guy on a slightly lighter tone. It's a little bit, it feels different, and I think you'll probably really enjoy just sort of playing around with both and deciding which one feels most sort of suitable for you, I suppose. But I'm quite happy with him as a sort of starting point, and we'll sort of develop this as we go. Okay, so let's try from another angle now. We're going to work on some of this crushed, lovely grey crushed paper, which I really, really like to work with. Again, it's nice to have that mid-tone and then to have the black and white to work with here, so do try it. And I'm going to start just with the very tip of his nose here. And I'm going to put in the white areas first because there are less of them, and it just makes sense to lead with the light here. Pop his ears in and then start to find that first bit of his body. I'm going to white that area just for now. And then when we get to sort of here, that sort of line from the top of his head, then we start to get a bit of the sort of bottom, this lovely rump. So again, I'm going to do that with my white to begin with. He's sort of twisted here, so it does sort of shorten him a little bit. They're actually quite strange and long, aren't they, badgers? I think you'll notice as you sort of get into this. And again, just pulling down my chalk on its side to start to get that sense of the belly and the chest. So if we've got this line here as our sort of lead line, then we're just going to pull down from there to find the body and the shape of the body. So here now I'm going to start to work in some of the black. So just using the edge of my charcoal for now, leaving a little gap for the eye if I can in this one. It's not easy to leave that gap for the eye. Just popping in that little first bit of stripe and just leaving a gap there. Knowing that there's another little stripe of black which then comes and joins the other around the back of the ear. And this area does tend to be quite black. And then it eases off as we get a bit further back. So I'm just going to be using the tip here just on those finer details rather than the whole chunk, right? Give it a blow. So already I'm starting to get that shape in. And then if I just sort of follow the line under his chin, then you can see that little triangle of white that's being left as we work our way towards the chest. This is all good work for our brains. It's like positive and negative space. It's going to blow again. So you don't want to press too hard. You don't want this to be like Dust City. And again, if you want it to really stick into the paper, you can give it a little bit of a blend with your finger. But we don't want to overblend here either, because I really do quite like those sharp definitions. So I'm going to go in with a pencil now. I've got the rough shape. I'm going to find the rest of that sort of space under his chin, because that gives me the sort of front of the body here. Love these Gioconda charcoal pencils. They're fab for this. And then really, really lightly going to come along and find the sort of bottom of his mouth. And then his nose, again, is at a bit of an angle. So if you pop in that sort of top line and just add a few strokes to it, you'll have his nose. It's really, really that simple. You don't have to be really complicated about these fine details. And you can't anyway. So finding the top of the head, you can't because you've got chalk and charcoal. See what I mean about me having that glitch? So you can't be too fussy, but already now we've got the sense of that shape of the badger in the head. And then when it comes to the rump, or the bottom again, I'm just going to put in a bit of black over the top, and I'm sort of skipping like this, which is quite nice to do. And then when I get to the bum, I'm going to curve again, because that gives me that sense of that roundness in the belly. Really satisfying to do this. And again, if you just imagine sort of pulling out the legs from that overall shape, that's really going to help you with this. I surprised myself. I just need you to know that. I surprised myself with this study once I got into it. And I think there's something about working on that sort of greyish slate tone that really helps with this. So again, I can use my pencil just to really find the edge. But here, I want to be pulling down with my materials to get that sense of that bear-like bottom. I don't know why, but I really like. I don't know, I relate to the badger and this sort of round bottom that follows it around. Is that mad to say? Yeah, but I do say these things on here. It's going to pop in his ear really lightly there. And the ear tends to be sort of cut up slightly by the stripe, and then you get a little bit of fluff on the end. And again, you can accentuate the white part of the ear here. And here as well, you've got this white of the ear, and then you can sort of sculpt the black around it. So I can find a little bit of black there just to give me the other side of that ear, if that makes sense. In some ways this is delicate work, but it's really, really good learning. I'm going to pop his eye in now. They always look better once they've got their eyes in, but the eyes can be the biggest challenge because we want to keep fiddling. So try not to keep fiddling. So a circle, another circle around that circle, and then we come in with the black. We put in the sort of eyelid, okay? So that already is looking quite badger-like. He looks quite alert. If you want to make him look a bit sleepier, just take the edge off that a little bit, yeah. And then again, I'm going to come in with a bit more white if I lose it. Just put a little highlight in there. And you know, it's going to take a bit of push and pull on the eye, so just keep playing with it. Keep adding dark, lightening up until you've got something that looks how you want it to. Isn't that just the greatest challenge of life, eh? And art. And then here, we can just go into that mark making again. So we can just find that mark making so that we can see that badger shifting off into those sort of greyish tones. So this sort of softness is much better for the back, I think. You know, just keep working that charcoal through and getting that sense of, you know, the front of the paw and the back paw, which probably would be off the back there somewhere. And then just some little bits of mark making around his nose. Again, I'm getting a bit chalky here, so that's a little bit more just to bring that down. And then some little bits of marks here as well, just to sort of show, you know, his whiskers, etc. And again, you know, you can pull some little whiskers out if you want to. So the one thing you would just want to be careful of is that eye, because you are going to want to fiddle faddle it. I still want to fiddle faddle it now, you know, and you don't need to. Just sort of pop it in and then try and leave it if you can. And again, you know, if you get the shape of the nose wrong, you can just come in with your white and sort of reshape it as well. That can be quite liberating to do, just to sort of refine the drawing, I suppose, but also allows you to sort of delete areas, which I find quite satisfying. So my second study a little bit different to my first, but that's all right, because we're humans, we're not machines, and we're not expected to produce sort of photocopies. I want an impression of my badger. I don't want a sort of photorealistic badger. That's not what we're aiming for here. We're just sort of getting a feel for how we can tackle a subject like the badger with different materials. So I just want you to try both and notice the difference, really. This one I sort of started from the nose and worked my way back, and you know, the back of the animal's not actually as important as getting that sort of front and that head right. The back of the animal sort of takes care of itself. If if you can get some of these bits of proportion at the front looking all right, then the back will look better too. So just remembering that. And then whenever there's not white, there's black, so that really helps as well. So you're just pushing and pulling between the white and the black until you get a balance that you're happy with, or you get a badger that looks like the badger that you were after. But just remembering you can use the white to delete, and then you can, you know, bring things back in with the black and be quite strong with the black, and you're just sort of trying to get that balance between the two in these two different studies. But I have to say, actually, I normally prefer to work on black, but I really enjoyed working on grey for this. It was really the right material, the right medium for what I was trying to achieve. So we're going to move into some inks now. So you might need, you know, you can just work in your sketchbook for this if you want to, or if you want to grab some watercolour paper as well, that might be helpful. We're just going to work with some black drawing ink. We're going to keep the chalk and charcoal pencils, because we're going to use them for some, you know, the more of the detail, the finishing touches. But just meet me back here, maybe have a chance to stick these in first and to fix them as well. You can just spray them with a little bit of hairspray, but just really lightly mist it if you want a nice fixed image for your sketchbook. But you know, that in terms of sort of how we sort out our sketchbook here, you know, just sort of making a bit of space for them, or choosing the best one and sticking it in, and just allowing some of these to just be sketches, not perfectly finished sort of studies, but just experiments in working with different materials to tackle the same subject. Okay. Okay folks, so we're going to get a little bit inky now. We're going to do some inky experiments, and you just need your size 2 rigger brush, which I sent you in the post if you've got it, and then just a slightly bigger wash brush for this. And we're just going to play an experiment with seeing if we can transfer from sort of dry materials into wet materials. So again, have some images in front of you for this, and what we're going to do is we're going to sort of find that top line of the badger first, like we did in the last experiment, I suppose, just with some black drawing ink. I'm a big fan of inks, me. And just a damp rigger brush, and you're just going to sort of start from the top of the head and work your way over the profile. This is going to look strange at first. Be okay with that, all right? So that's the very tip of the nose there. And you know, then we're going to find sort of the ear shape. This is not the full point of this. And then here I'm just going to sort of start to put a bit of that badger stripe in, okay? And then dip your brush into some water, and we're going to just pull down and soften that ink. So this is just sort of playing around with that sort of top line as a guide, and then softening the ink and seeing if we can find that sort of overall shape of the badger. So again, I was talking about pulling down in the last bit, and this is exactly what this is. We're just sort of finding that top line and pulling down from it. So here I'm going to soften off some of that ink I've already done, and this just stops us from being, you know, too fussy, I suppose. Sometimes my little ideas like this scare you a little bit. Don't be afraid. Just use that tip of the rigger brush just to sort of start to find that line. And if you find that line is slightly off or your body's not quite long enough, just keep encouraging that ink back and see if you can find that overall shape. Don't worry if it's not looking right at this stage. It will. This is just a sort of play and experiment. So here I'm going to find the bottom of the face, and then I'm going to pull that, again, just that diluted ink into this area and see if I can find my badger in a slightly different way here, okay? So again, my body is not quite long enough, so I'm going to pull it out just a little bit more and just starting to get a feel for that body. And, oops, the very tip of the nose. So we can work over this with other materials afterwards. It's just about getting back to the sort of bare essentials. Bare. And I'm going to let that ink flood all the way into there. So I'm just trying to achieve some looseness here, really. But also sort of getting that sense of the shape of the body just by pulling down. So here I can find, you know, those sort of front paws. Here I can find sort of those bear-like feet. And again, don't worry if they look a bit weird at first. Here I can find, you know, just by dipping into the ink, you know, the other leg, and then knowing that the other one will be about here. So we're just using the ink in a bit of a sort of sumi-y way, like in a way, sort of finding the lines first, and then letting the water soften, and even finding his little tail there. And again, knowing that we can come and work back into this afterwards with some other materials, so maybe some chalk and charcoal. That is more than okay. But just sort of using this as a guide, and then maybe, just maybe, you know, connecting the dots with a real light, loose line. So some more badger sketching, but with just with some inks this time, just for a bit of a change. And, you know, even you can start to play with some mark making with this brush over the top and start to put some of that texture in as well. So these inky studies, I just sort of felt called to do. It seemed to make sense to use ink when we're looking at sort of black and white subjects, but also a chance to play with that one brush and sort of, you know, use it for line, but also use it as a sort of wash. So playing around with both aspects, and this is just sort of builds up technical control, these kind of exercises, and sort of helps you to see your subject a little bit more clearly, I suppose. And again, you can ground him, so, you know, put him in the ground, put him on some grass. He doesn't have to sort of sit. It doesn't always make sense when they're sort of just sitting on a white page. So, you know, even this rigger brush can be used for a bit of mark making or to make some sort of grass around him. And it's incredibly effective just with the ink. It's just thinking of sort of what's the pared back, what's the essence of this little animal, this little creature. Oops. and just forgiving yourself for dropping ink in a sort of loose way. But it's sort of trying to find that looseness when we're capturing these subjects, I suppose, and finding lots of different ways to approach them. So let's do another one, but we'll do it from the other side. I'll get my little badger image in shot so I can see him. And again, sort of, if I hold my brush quite sort of further down, I can sort of start to sketch that shape of the bum, which, you know, I really like a big badger's bum. Gosh, that's a strange thing to say when I say it out loud. It sounds all right in my head. You know, finding the shape of the head, We should be quite tuned in by now, so this should make this a little bit easier. Again, if there's any of these exercises that just don't resonate, don't let yourself think it's something to do with you. What I like to do is offer a few different approaches, and then you choose the ones which make sense to you. I'm just going to pop in his ear. And on the other side as well, just sort of get an idea of where his ear is. It's that same work really, but just with a different material here, and seeing how that feels. Starting to get that sense of the sort of the darkness underneath his chin, starting to sort of fill that in, letting that front leg lead like it wants to, you know, and I almost could have gone a little bit finer, I think, on his nose. But again, I can sketch really quite loosely. I can sketch quite loosely with this rigger brush. Pop his eye in just real loosely as well. And we're just sort of trying to give them a bit more character, our bears. And then again, just softening off with the brush and allowing that ink to sort of pull down to find the shape of his body. I suppose these are a little bit more wind in the willows. It's really interesting. Again, it's like the dormice when I was looking at all these images on the web. You know, it's an artist's impression of a badger. It's an artist's impression of a dormouse. It may not, you know, it doesn't need to be perfectly accurate as long as you're getting the sense or the sort of character of that creature coming through. And I'd probably move on to, once I've found that shape, I'll probably move on to just working over the top of that with some different materials. So some of mine have come out amazing and some of them have come out a little bit odd, and it's just being okay with that, but really just sort of using that top line to help you find the shapes, and just again working in a sort of real pared back way, and knowing that I can come and work into these, which I will do in a second, and I'll show that to you. Anyone who's out there going, oh my God, what? You know, it's okay. We're going to make it work a little bit more in the next bit. I'm chucking in a big old bit of black there because it is there. And again, just finding that shape under the belly, sort of starting to establish maybe that front paw, but just real loosely, and just putting the rest of that black in before I do anything else. And then I'll come and work into these as soon as they are dry with some other materials, but it's just sort of getting a feel for. And then I'm going to show you how to do a sort of curled up version of this, which actually I think is a lot easier than the whole badge. But just let that dry and then I'll be back, all right? Okay, so we've got these quite active badgers that are sort of tootling around the place. And we're going to work into them a little bit now with our chalk and our charcoal. Now we've laid that inky base. So we're going to do these active badgers first, and then just to close this cycle, we're going to have it go at doing some little sleepy curled up badgers too. So we get that nice range. I mean, as I was saying to you before, there's no room for perfection here. Let's just experiment, let's play, let's discover, let's explore. So I've got just my chalk and charcoal pencils again, and I'm going to go now and work in some mark making over the top, because obviously these are quite flat. But what does happen, which is quite nice when you soften the ink, is you get some really nice highlights too. So that allows me to see the areas which are light, which some of them I can just leave like that, but there are some areas that I just need to go back and work into. So if we start with this badger at the bottom here, he's not quite right, but that's okay. So what we're going to do is just start by coming back in and finding the white that I lost with my ink, and we can use that again like we did in the last section. I'm just going to blow off the excess as I go. We can use that as we did in the last sort of section, just to sort of push and pull at areas that might have got a little bit too black, and sort of put those areas back in. I'm just sort of blowing off the excess as I go. We don't want this too chalky or too, what am I trying to say? Just not too dusty really, I suppose. So just sort of establishing the white areas, any areas that I've lost to begin with, working some light onto the back in the areas that I can see it too, starting to work over the top of that ink and add this sort of softness from the charcoal, which I think really complements the fur in the same way that the pastel pencils in the last cycle will have done as well. And then coming in with the black and balancing that out a little bit too. So, you know, adding more dark where it needs to be added, like here around the ear. And enhancing some areas like this, deepening them, darkening them around the nose. And this just seems to work really, really nicely for these little badger tadges. All sorts of names I've been giving them. Brock the badger. And then again coming in and sort of looking at this line here, and if I've gone too far, which I sort of slightly have, we can sort of delete. So again, we're making this as sort of the working document. We're not expecting everything to be perfect straight away. We're just laying that base with the ink and then coming back in and working those fine details with our chalk and charcoal, or with your pastel pencils if you like, if that's what you've got to hand. And when we add this sort of furriness, this fluffiness, I just think this really, really helps to make these look more badger-like. If you follow the sort of direction of the fur with your mark making, it just makes them look a little bit more animate. So we're not just relying on that inky work that we did before. We're working over the top of that to find the true shape of our badger. And each of my badgers, like I said, has come out quite different looking. So don't beat yourself up. If some of them look a bit odd, that is okay. Just working with black and white's a nice boundary, but it can also be a bit tricky too. So I'm just coming in and working the eye now, and just that little bit of detail on the eye makes a huge difference. Darkening around it as well will really make that eye pop. So don't just rely on the light in the eye. Think about darkening too. And again, those little fine marks, this general to particular working, and even running some real light lines over the white and, you know, through the white, just so we get that sense of it being fur rather than just a block, is really important. But this whole area here is quite dark, isn't it? So we can allow that to be dark. Yeah. And suddenly my badger has sort of come to life from looking like a big dumpy, blocky sort of badger. He's now sort of starting to look a little bit more realistic, which is always a relief, isn't it? Especially when you're teaching. And again, exactly the same on this guy. He's actually, where the ink has dried, he's got quite a nice little eye established already. So I'm just going to go in with my chalk and accentuate that a little bit. And then again, everything which I did that looks so loose and so almost slightly weird with the ink, we can tidy it up afterwards. It's just nice to try a different base, I think. That's what I was aiming for there. And each time we do one of these little sketches, one of these little studies, we're enhancing our observation of our subject and getting to know him better. And, you know, oops, he's looking sideways now. And yeah, mine, I've just the more I draw them, the more I get a sense of their character rather than just their shape. And that's the challenge here, is making these little creatures look animated. So just working up a little bit, just the underside of his mouth. Again, enhancing the work that I've already done. You know, intuitively we can find these shapes quite easily, but sometimes we don't trust our sort of creative intuition with this stuff, and we ought to more. So I'm just coming back in, re-establishing his little white stripe, the bit that I'd sort of lost. And again, you can do that work over the body. That will make a huge difference to the overall sense of shape and, you know, where the feet are and that lovely texture. So just with a little bit of working in there, these drawings or these sort of inky sketches transform from being quite sort of simplistic to having a bit more character, having a little bit more movement. So just wanted to show you that inky base as well, just for those of you that don't have, you know, or may not have access to all the toned paper and things like that, you know, an inky base can work just as well. And in just a few strokes, this has gone from quite flat to quite animate, and I've been able to sort of correct some of my mistakes, but also enhance my observation at the same time. So don't forget that you've got to run the white through too if you want to get that real sort of sense of that shaggy fur. And once that base is sort of laid, it feels much easier to do those little finishing touches, I think, and making him a true badger rather than just a sort of lumpy, inky shape, I suppose. And again, just remembering you can delete. So I had a sort of offline there, but I can delete that little line just by working a bit of white over the top. So again, it's that push and pull, but we're getting a sense of sort of the whole character of the animal when we work in this way. And just each time we do a study, it's simple as that. Each time we do a study, we're getting more familiar with our subject. We're getting more confident and giving ourselves the opportunity to have those little light bulb moments, and to really understand the shape of the body, but also, you know, the sort of behaviour of the fur and how that gives us the overall shape and characteristics of something like a badger. So, lots to consider already in this cycle, and we're going to close this cycle by sensing that it's cold outside, because it is, and thinking about how our badgers might behave in that situation. So we're going to curl them up now, just using some real simple work with the ink yet again, and just the soft materials over the top. We're going to curl them up so they can have a little bit of a rest, a bit of a sleep, which is all I seem to want to do at this stage in January, the longest month of the universal year, isn't it? So just taking things at the pace of nature, we're just going to pop them to bed, let them curl up and have a little sleep. So I'll be back in a second. I'm just going to use the space on this page, and we're going to do some little curled up badgies just to finish off this cycle. So I shall see you shortly. And of course, there's always a thought that I have as soon as I switch off my recording devices. I always have a little thought, and I was just thinking about all that lovely work we did over the autumn season about having these full and rich pages, and I feel like so far I've been a bit bitty with this in terms of working in sketchbook. So I've been consciously putting some awareness there and trying to get back into that working in the sketchbook practice, not working on lots of different types of paper. I just wanted to talk about these guys and the images that I was working with, because obviously these guys are all above ground, so they always seem to be surrounded, especially when they're outdoors, by a little sea of green. And in the spirit of nice, full, rich pages, there are a couple of things that you can do just to complete these pages. The first one is just to do some pastel work. So if I take just a couple of different tones of pastel, maybe like an olivey pastel and maybe a warmer sappy green pastel, then I can go in and add a little bit of green to their environment, which might be quite nice actually, because this is sort of closer to the reference pictures. Just taking extra care not to undo some of the lovely work I've done. And, you know, like, just let's put them in their environment. If they're outdoors, if they're jamming around, if it's not too cold just yet, let's root them in that environment. And again, the smudging just pushes that pastel into the tooth of the paper. It just means it won't transfer so much to your other pages. So this is why we blend with pastels, is to connect our subject. Got to be a little bit careful around your badge, because you don't want to pull too much black, which is what I just did, into the sort of surroundings. But sometimes when you put sort of a more colourful ground around it, it sort of brings your actual subject to life. So I've started with a nice warm green, and then just for the ground here, I'm going to go for this like more olivey green, and just again using it on its side, because we know that a lot of the badger sort of disappears into the undergrowth. Just using it on its side, adding a little bit of texture there, just to sort of, you know, stop him from floating in the air, I suppose. Stop him from floating in space. So sometimes when they're just sort of floating on the page like that, they can look a little bit odd. You put them back in their environment and suddenly, boom, it's a badger, right? So that's the pastel version of that. And then, you know, you can also do the same just with some watercolours. So I've got a little bit of sap green here, just getting my wash brush, popping that down. I'm being real, I'm making myself be loose with this. So just giving him a little bit of a ground, pulling that around again, just being mindful of the areas where you've got a lot of ink and things like that, but also just being loose with it, letting it move and shift. And funnily enough, if I go up to this pastel-y area, I can actually work my brush over that pastel, and that can be quite nice too, you know? Let's make the pastel into something a little bit more liquid. And then just around his bottom and things, you know, so I'm just using the back of I'm using my brush and pressing hard. So I'm getting no marks, just softness here. And there I've picked up a little bit of the ink, I think. So that's sort of merging into my background, but I'm all right with that, as long as you're all right with that. Yeah, so just let's make them actually in an environment on the page rather than sort of just hanging out on their own. And you'll find the coloured pastels work really well on that black ground as well. They work really, really nicely. Or on the grey ground, you'll see the colours appear sort of more vibrant than they would do normally. And even if you add a bit of water to those pastels, you're ending up getting a nice sort of texture, which I think is rather lovely. So I just would have put a bit of sap green there, a little bit of undersea green. That can work just as well if you've just got the paints and you haven't really got the range of pastels. That's a bit of undersea, just under the shadowy areas of my little badge. And just creating a little bit more unity on the page. Okay, so I was rudely interrupted by my battery running out on my camera there, but all I was saying really was that, you know, lovely that nature sort of is collaborative, that species can sort of work together and tolerate each other and accommodate each other. And that's one of the things we'll be looking at in cycle 4 is sort of who lives in a badger set. And it's not just badgers, so that's really quite interesting. So looking at the behaviour underground, those underground networks, and also thinking about, you know, Beatrix Potter from cycles 1 and 2 that we were looking at for inspiration, and then Wind in the Willows. It's definitely our inspiration for cycles 3 and 4. How could it not be when we're looking at badgers? And maybe we'll look at some moles, who knows? But yeah, just thinking about sort of that sort of interdependence and that sort of community that exists in the animal kingdom, you know, and this collaboration which we imagine is there, but I think is actually there, you know. I'm just thinking about the impact as well of some of those illustrators, you know, and some of those authors, and perhaps that sort of connection to nature that they encouraged in us from a young age, that sort of treasuring and seeing animals as being animate, you know, seeing them as being sort of soulful, not just sort of robotic, you know. And yes, I just find that very interesting in itself, you know, how we form and build a connection, how we sort of try and humanize animals so that we can understand them. But perhaps we ought to look to their behavior and their habits and perhaps animalize ourselves rather than try and humanize them, yeah? Anyway, last little exercise, real simple. You just need your rigger brush, your thin one, and, you know, you want it to be damp but not soaking wet, please. And I want you to hold it again, hold your brush a little bit further down. We're going to dip into the ink, and this is what we're going to do. So just getting rid of any excess water first. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a wrist arc. So I'm going to go real lightly arcing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep turning my page. This will make sense in a minute. So keep turning. Not easy for you to see, I know. Keep turning. until you have, oh dear, this is why I thought maybe it might be an idea to do this on watercolour paper, but it's okay, we'll do the book. Let's just go for it. So we're just making a circle to begin with, like a sort of nesty circle. Yeah. Then we're going to put in the nose of the badger about here. Okay, just a few little marks with the brush just to begin with. Then we're going to put the ear in here. And this line is just going to find the sort of bottom of the chin, which we've had a chance to look at now. And we're going to pop his other ear in, like that. That's it, real simple. And then from there, I'm going to pull out this next line of that fur, because we know that's a real useful guide for us, don't we? Hopefully my nose isn't poking into the shot. I really don't like it when that happens. And then from here, literally, just going to do that same thing, but with these curled up badgies. So I'm going to take that line there that I've already got. Oop. This bit on the head is a bit more delicate work. I'll give you that. Adding water now, so no more ink. Just adding water and softening off those lines that we already have, okay? So I'm going to take that little line a bit further just to sort of connect to the nose. And then add a little bit more ink into this area here. I'm going to leave a little gap for the eye around here somewhere. Of course, our badger's going to be sleeping, so we don't need to worry so much about his eye in this one. Just bringing that ink up to the areas where I think it's needed. And then just water on the brush now, softening off that back line. This is what I was saying about following lines, pulling down from that top line. And again, you can use this as a sketch, but you can strengthen it afterwards. So I'm going to add a bit more ink now. I'm going to go a bit more dramatic because I just really like what it does. And I'm going to keep working my way around to the sort of tip, the tail. So all this is just going to be pulled out here. And again, I don't think this is an original idea, but it's just sort of just harking back to our little sleepy creatures in cycles 1 and 2. Little bits of mark making. Try not to soften that chin too much. You can soften around the chin. And then we know that that's quite dark under the chin, don't we? So having done all these observational studies, I'm going to pop a bit more black into there. I just love watching what the ink does when you drop it into a wet area of the page. So, and it's still just sort of thinking about that technique of pulling down from that main line of the body. And so I pull a little bit more of that down. I'm just going to do one of these, but you can do loads of them because they're really, really satisfying to do. So don't just stop at one like me. You can play with this idea as much as you like. I'm not actually going to do his eye. I'm just going to leave a gap around it because I'm going to do that with my pastel pencil or with my charcoal pencil even. I am just going to go back one more time over this line because it's not quite dark enough. There we go. So we get that real defined stripe, and it's really nice doing this with the rigger brush because the rigger brush really holds its shape. It doesn't collapse. And then just a little bit of black on the ear. Trying to remember where the black goes on the ear. A little bit there, and then maybe just a little bit of mark making just with the end of the brush here. You can make yours bigger as well. I've made this really dinky. I don't know why. I think just wanting to do that delicate work. And then because he's nesting, well, he's not nesting, is he? Sorry. But because he will be sort of curled up in his little set, surrounded just by the same things as the dormice and the hedgehogs, you know, leaf litter, dried grass. If he's out in the wild, things they pull into their sets and make little sort of den-like beds. I'm just going to put a little bit of that straw-like stuff around the side because that just gives me that sense of that he's all curled up and he's sleeping. So it's just a shape really, it's just a circular shape as you can see. And I'm going to let that dry, and I recommend doing a few of these. It's just really, really nice to do. And I don't know, something about this sort of spiraling in at this time of the year, this time of introspection, sort of bringing that energy in, just seems to fit really well. So I always have this overall theme, but with the badgers, I just was really called intuitively to work with them. I love their symbolism, you know, their tenacity, the little thing about stop badgering me, and that is sort of determination, not giving up. And these little guys have had a lot of challenges in their lives, you know. I don't think, when I was a kid, I used to think they were called badges instead of badgers, and I was just confused because I only ever saw them on the side of the road, which I think is sad in itself, isn't it? And then of course they're culled because they're seen to be carriers of TB, or they are carriers of TB, except that in more recent years they've realised that by culling badgers, all they do is just push them out further afield in search of sanctuary. So actually they're starting to realise that by culling badgers, they're actually spreading the TB more because they're scaring them and they're pushing them out of their usual territories. So again, it's that, you know, we are all connected, aren't we? We're connected to these creatures. What we do has an impact on them, but it also has an impact on us again, you know, and it's not often as simple as just culling creatures to solve, you know, the problems of the modern world, is it? I expect you'll agree with me on that one. Anyway, I'm going to let him dry and then we'll just do the finishing touches on him. Thank you for being patient with me as I'm working my way through this. Some bits will work for you, some bits won't. Don't take it too personally. But I hope that by the end of this cycle, you'll just feel a bit more connected to these little guys who live so much of their lives underground and in the dead of night when we're all asleep. Okay, folks, so just to close this cycle, you know, if you want to work over the top of these little sleeping badgies, then go back to your chalk and charcoal pencil. You know, you can use the charcoal to work around any of the fine details like the ear here and just make sure that's nice and black. You can use it to intensify around the eye if you want to. Any details on the eye, I mean, it's closed anyway, but just leaving a tiny little highlight like that can just give you the idea of the outside edge of the eye. And then here I'm just working texture over the top. So lots of little marks to build up that texture. Don't worry about the feet and the hands for this one. It's more of an illustration. So feet and the hands, well, the paws, really. I've made my badgers way too human, I think. Just don't worry about those elements, just sort of getting that sense of this little curled up creature with his little feet tucked in, you know, and even this area here where there's the gap, that can just, you know, be softened off with some ink if you want to, so it just becomes like a little shadow area, but without going sort of too incredibly dark, so that we keep that lovely outline of the face. But mostly just working with the chalk and charcoal here. And if that's too tiny and tiddly and piddly, you could go in with a gel pen if it's dry enough. I don't know if mine is, but just to get that sense of that sleepy badge, you can add a little bit of white with a gel pen, and that can work just as well. And again, the nose, you're just hinting at the nose, so just a little line for the nose is absolutely fine there. And I'm just going to close off that shape there, just little finishing touches here. And again, if you want to inject a little bit of colour into this, you know, we've looked at the sort of nesting materials of things like the dormice, haven't we? Sorry, just to bring that in so really suddenly out of the blue. But, you know, these browns could be worked around the edge as well. But don't worry too much about the sleepy badgers, because we're going to look more at the sets and the environment underground in the next cycle, as I said. So this is just the same techniques and approaches, but sort of from a different angle each time, and just playing around with some of the different shapes that badgers make and seeing if we can capture them in different ways. So I welcome you to add a few of these, and I've done some in my sketchbook today, but I've done quite a few on watercolor paper as well, because that can be really quite nice, and just playing around with that shape over and over and over again. Yeah, so I got so many studies around me, and the more you paint and draw them, the more you'll get to know these little critters and perhaps fall in love with them as deeply as I have done during cycle 3. So trying to get back into some sketchbook work here now, trying to sort of integrate some of our studies back into our pages again in preparation for cycle 4, and just playing around with a real simple sort of group of materials in different ways, in order to get sort of more realistic, more animated badger studies. And that's it. I'm going to stop talking now, but I hope you enjoy some of the exercises that I've come up with for you in this cycle, and this is just going to unfold as we move into cycle 4 as well. So, stay with me for the ongoing journey. Okay?